Well, good afternoon. My name is Jeff Cohen. I'm the Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer at Informs, the largest association for the decision and data sciences. Welcoming you to our first of three webinars in the coming months about the very important topic around supply chains. So Informs members support organizations and governments at all levels as organizations seek to turn information convert data into information and glean insights from that information that lead to more efficient and effective, equitable, and impactful results. Informs has about 10,000 members who are comprised of a diverse community of experts in analytics, data science, operations research, artificial intelligence, applied mathematics, and many other related fields. And their work touches literally every sector of our society and our economy as they work to save lives and save money and solve problems in all kinds of different ways. So over the coming months, we're going to be featuring a series of these webinars, as I mentioned, that include leading experts on supply chains. We'll provide insights into how various sectors have been impacted, what meaningful solutions exist to create strong supply chain resiliency, and the tools needed to effectively identify and correct potential supply chain disruptions before they happen. Now, today in particular, we're going to explore how supply chains have failed, how to solve these issues, as well as forecasting what to expect in 2022. We are joined by two Informs members who are both nationally recognized for their expertise in supply chain issues, Chris Tang at UCLA and Robert Handfield at North Carolina State University. Chris and Robert, thank you both for being with us today. We appreciate your time. And so Chris, let me get right to it with a question. Really, my questions will be for both of you, but Chris, I'll ask you to lead off. So to begin with, most of us tend to think about supply chains when we go to a local store and we see that the product we wanted isn't on the shelf. Obviously, that's just the end of the supply chain. But can you paint a picture for us about how supply chains work? What nodes along that supply chain are subject to vulnerabilities?
Thank you, Jeff, for having me. Well, in terms of supply chain, is omnipresent, but it's not visible. When things are working, no one thinks about it. That's why the public did not really think about supply chain until this pandemic. Now, let me use a simple example. Most consumers think about product availability and the price they observe at the supermarket or the store. The supply chain is really from end to end. So it's really starting from the raw material suppliers to the manufacturers, to the logistics providers. In some cases, could ship across the ocean, to the ports, to the distributors, to the warehouse, to the retailers, to consumers. Now, this is only captured the material flows that the press has really focusing on. But beneath the physical flow, there's a supply chain, there is information flow to coordinate, to communicate, as well as financial flows, how they get the payments from one party to the next. Now, in terms of your question, which node is more vulnerable? Unfortunately, right now, every single node is vulnerable. From the physical flow perspective, we are focusing on the ports. It's actually every single link of the supply chain, they are facing some problem. Information flow, we have experienced cyber attack, like the Colonial, the pipeline, which had to pay the ransomware. And the meat packing plant, JBS, also need to pay the ransomware. So that is also the information risk along the supply chain, right? So I'm going to stop here.
Great. Rob, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think Chris captured the description of supply chains quite well. I think there's multiple vulnerabilities, and these are really popping up at the moment, and that's what we're seeing today. It's almost like the perfect storm. So, for instance, we've seen, COVID itself has caused disruptions at a lot of ports, especially in China, Yangtian, and a few others. It's caused disruption at manufacturing sites in Vietnam and Sri Lanka. We've also had some raw material shortages in certain types of raw materials that have resulted in those disruptions. Labor has been a real problem. There's massive labor shortages here in warehousing, distribution, trucking, and in other even just manufacturing sites as well. Believe it or not, climate change is a big problem as well. We saw disruptions in Texas due to the freeze that shut down a lot of the refineries, that resulted in a lack of resin. And resin was used in everything from packaging to plastic injection molded parts, etc. And it also led to a lack of PVC. And then we had the Hurricane Ida, which came in and hit Texas as well. So all of these disruptions, raw material, labor, transportation, COVID, climate change, all of these things are hitting at once. And so supply chains are really under attack. And that's why we're seeing so many disruptions, because you only have to disrupt one node in that supply chain and the whole thing can shut down.
Yeah. So I think you both sort of pointed to this, right? So during the pandemic, the public's awareness about supply chain and those vulnerabilities is probably larger than it has ever been. Right? They can't get the products that they want or they need when they want them or when they need them. So COVID brought this to light for many people, but I'm wondering, and Rob in particular, you sort of began to address this, but underneath the pandemic, how much of this groundwork was already being laid before the pandemic really affected the global economy?
Well, I'll jump in and just share some thoughts. I think part of the problem is people didn't know that they were vulnerable. And the reason is beyond what they call their tier one, their immediate suppliers, they didn't even understand who was in their supply chain. They didn't understand where the stuff came from. And so we're seeing this today that certain sectors are being hit really hard. Semiconductors is one. People have no idea what's going on with semiconductors. We're seeing things with rubber, with appliances, with all of these different sectors, because people don't understand who is in their supply chains. And these vulnerabilities are occurring further up the chain, and they're suddenly realizing they don't have visibility to these things. And so we've always had very, very fragile supply chains. And the more we outsource globally, the more fragile and risky and delicate these supply chains became. And they've all sort of just collapsed. It's caught up to us now, and we're paying the piper for all those extended supply chains that we've developed over time. Chris, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, thank you. Well, let me supplement your great comments regarding supply chain risk. The risk has always been present for a long time. So I have written co-written a book on supply chain risk management in 2012. That is after we experienced the financial meltdown in 2009. We experienced about the Boeing 787, the product development delay, and also a lot of product recalls about the risk importing products from Asia. So the risk is already there. But before the pandemic, all the risks are more sectoral, based on a particular sector, or regional. But the pandemic make it global. So that's why extremely visible. Now, then the question, what is the underlying cause of this supply chain risk being so disruptive this time? Why it is a perfect storm? Now, bear in mind, because of during the lockdown, you stay at home, people work from home. So a lot of people, the demand has shifted. The consumer's expenditure has shifted from services to durable goods. They buy more electronics, computers, furniture to work from home, children play from home, home repair. So the demand surge. Just this year alone, in July, relative to the year before, the consumer's expenditure for durable goods increased by 30%. Now, that's point number one. Point number two is that from last year, the retailers learned that just-in-time inventory just didn't work when you had disruption. So they pivoted into just-in-case. So the consumer demand went up, but the retailer also stocked up even more. So all of a sudden, there's a surge in the demand. But the supply side, we're also facing a problem because in Asia, vaccines is not widely available. United States were surplus, but many developed countries, they don't have enough vaccines. So whenever there is any outbreak, the factory lockdown, shutdown, that's what we experience in Vietnam, as well as even some Chinese factories, as well as Bangladesh. So as a result, the supply is also limited, the demand is huge. So as a result, we don't have this balance of supply and demand. That's what triggered this kind of panic supply chain crisis.
Well, thank you both for that. So, Chris, as I'm listening to you and Rob talk about this, it's not lost on me that our audience today is predominantly from the policy community, and policymakers are looking at a wide variety of supply chain solutions. I'll say in quotes, most notably, around the idea of onshoring, aspects of it. But I'm wondering if you could both address, and Chris, I'll start with you. What should policymakers really be considering when identifying ways to make our supply chains more resilient?
Well, thank you. This is truly a wake-up call for the entire nation. I think during last year, during the PPE shortages, and also that we don't know where the materials available, the information is not there. So for example, even based on the Fed set the policies, but the execution is done by the state. This is our healthcare policy. But that itself can work if the information is completely transparent. But unfortunately, each state, each county, they have their own information system. And a lot of times the information is not openly shared with the Fed. So as a result, even the government does not have full information about the demand and supply at each state and each county. So that's, without information, difficult to manage. So putting that aside, in terms of the product availability, the onshoring, now, we have done that, but it failed. Give you one example, PPE, the mask. Last year, we did not have enough masks, and then there are 29 companies in the United States, they start producing masks. It was very successful until China opened up. Then the demand went to the roof and back down on the earth, and all these mask manufacturers in the US are in financial difficulties. Now, so I think that we need to broaden our mindset in terms of onshoring. What does it mean? I would propose in terms of regional or domestic or shoring or nearshoring by leveraging USMCA trade agreements, right? Now, there are three levers that we can play with. The first one is a national stockpile. We have those, but was poorly managed. So I hope that we learn from the lessons. There's a better inventory management system need to put in place, making sure those products are not obsolete, they're still functional. We experienced that for the ventilators. Second, we need to have a hybrid mode of capacity available. Some of them could be based on global sourcing, that is supply overseas, but also we should have regional suppliers. US, that's purely beyond US, is a cost not competitive. So I think that we need to rely on Mexico or Canada to make the cost more reasonable. So that is by combining global and regional suppliers, we may be able to shift back and forth whenever we need it. So there's a second lever. The third one, I'm very excited to propose that. I think that I've spoken with the US Senate subcommittee on this, is about building a domestic US capability, not capacity yet, to such that in emergencies, we can pivot to convert this capability into manufacturing capacity. Let me give you a couple of examples. First one, 3D printing technology. So this one, I think that US has a consortium. This is called American Mix, based in Ohio. 3D printing is a very agile technology. It's portable, it's movable, and also can pivot from one product to other products. So as long as you set up the capability, that is very important. Second one, for the semiconductor, we have the consortium in the past, the Symantec, based in Texas, so on semiconductor. So we need to leverage the collaboration between the governments, the private sector, and the university, such that the nation can rebuild the capability again. Now, bear in mind, we are way, way, way behind. United States only produce 7% of our engineers who are majoring engineers in the university. 7% of our undergrads graduating with university degree is majoring in engineering. But in China, 33% of the undergraduate majors are engineers. So we are way behind. So the government needs to also encourage more students to study STEM subjects, such that we can rebuild the technical capability in the United States. So I think that is something. I'm going to stop here. I turn it over to Rob.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. You know, and just as an aside, I served on the Joint Acquisition Task Force as part of the U.S. Air Force back in March through June of 2020, and we worked quite closely with the National Stockpile, as well as hospitals, DHS, and so forth. And subsequent to that, I testified to the U.S. Senate Committee on Government Affairs and Homeland Security back in May of this year. As part of that testimony, I had a written testimony that made some explicit recommendations about many of the things that we've been talking about here, including onshoring. You know, the problem with onshoring is, as Chris says, it takes time. You know, the 50% of the world's semiconductors is produced in Taiwan, and Taiwan Semiconductor, we've mapped out their supply chain. They have 2,500 in their tier 1 and more than 10,000 in their tier 2. You don't bring an entire industry over to the US by, you know, setting up one fab plant. So we've got a long way to go to be able to bring that back here. You know, I will say that I think that we also have to create incentives for reshoring. You know, during this crisis, a lot of PPE manufacturers sprung up here in the US. And you know, they borrowed funds from the government, they started up. And the problem is today they're all going bankrupt. And the reason they're going bankrupt is medical distributors and health and hospitals are telling them they're too expensive compared to China. And so they're all going bankrupt. So I think you know, CMS and other government agencies should mandate that at least 10% of hospital spend should be on domestic hospital manufacturers in critical areas like PPE. I think we also need to you know, create an agency for supply chain disruption. They have these task forces. They don't amount to anything. They're temporary. They disappear. One other area I think we need to be better prepared is what I would call medical intelligence. I've been talking to a lot of people about this, and medical intelligence involves looking for the signals that indicate that there's another pathogen that's emerging in China. And the signals were all there back in December. The signals were not broadcast properly, they weren't interpreted, and people didn't act on them. So, you know, today we know those pathogens come over, they're airborne. You know, those signals can be tracked and managed. And then we need to have a task force, more than a task force, I would say an agency that's looking at what's going on within our own hospital systems, and have a control tower to say, well, how much inventory do we have of PPE, of propofol, of other critical supplies, so that we can rapidly deploy them or store them appropriately. You know, the national stockpile was never designed to deal with a crisis like COVID. We need to have something that is designed to deal with it today.
So Chris and Rob, thank you both. I know you've put out quite a bit just in that question alone. For our viewers, and I'll remind you again at the end, we'll follow up today's webinar with some contact information for me, so that if you'd like to speak with Chris and Rob, we can arrange that for you so you can discuss these things in greater detail. So moving on, one of the things that I'm curious about here is, it seemed, at least in COVID, that we didn't realize, or the public didn't realize that there was a supply chain problem until there was a supply chain problem. And I'm wondering, are there ways that an early warning system or systems can be developed and deployed that can identify those types of potential problems, convey that information, and address them before you get to the end of the supply chain where you have real consumer impact?
Sure, I
So
can jump in. I'll jump in and take that. So, as I said earlier, I think, medical intelligence is the first part of that. You need to have some kind of system that enables you to detect that there's emerging pathogens. And these are airborne. So they're going to come into major cities, Los Angeles, New York, New Jersey. A really good book by Michael Lewis called Premonition that talks about that. If you're interested in those early warning signals, and it's a public health issue, and I think that's the issue. But you also need to have, some crosswalk that tells you, well, given that we have these different medical threats, how do we? What are the materials that we need to have to deal with them in our ICUs? And so forth. Also, we need to be thinking about staffing. Staffing is a real problem today in many hospitals. There's a shortage of nurses, technicians, et cetera. In fact, with the mandated vaccines, they've pulled that back because they realize they're not going to be able to deal with all the requirements in getting the people. So these early warning systems can give us, ring the bells and raise the red flag to say, there's a new pathogen out there, it's coming over, and what are the things that we can do to address that? And you need visibility to be able to do that. You can't do anything without visibility. Without visibility, it's like driving your car with no fuel tank and no speedometer, right? You don't know how fast you're going, you don't know if you're going to run out of gas. So we need to have data that will give us not only early warning systems, but give us an understanding of the current state of our supply chains and where we need to rapidly get new materials and identifying new sources of materials as well.
Chris, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I fully agree with Rob in terms of he focused on the pathogen and the information system. Right now, my understanding is the federal governments, they lack the information system or the data to really act upon it. So if we want the early warning system, I think that the data integration need to put in place, and also we need collaboration with other agencies as well as the private sectors to share information. So let me use one example. In November, Pete Buttigieg and his team, they established the supply chain dashboard. Now, the dashboard right now is not very useful because it's only updated every 2 weeks. So as Rob pointed out, you're really looking at the real mirror. You cannot take action upon it. So if we're serious about it, and I think they really need to keep track of information about real time. So the dashboard keep track of how many containers coming into the United States and how many is actually moved to the warehouse and moved to the retailers, and also in terms of the product availability. So information is step one. Now, in the context of supply chain risk management, that's based on the book I have co-written, there are 4 things you need to focus on. One is identify risk. Second one is to evaluate the risk. The third step is how to mitigate the risk. The fourth step is how to respond to risk. Now, the information system, the early warning system, supply chain transparency, supply chain mapping will help you to get the first step to identify which node could be vulnerable. Now, if you want to take action upon it, you need to be more proactive. Second, you need to run stress tests. Given your current supply chain, how vulnerable are you? In case one of the nodes, one of the links could have a problem, how long does it take you to recover, time to recover, time to respond? You need to know that. So in that case, you can identify the scale of the magnitude of the disruption. And the third step is knowing that, can you put in place some contingency plan just in case so that you can respond to? So that's where maybe the national stockpile come into play. It's a mitigation plan. You need to put in a plan. If you don't have a plan, it's worse. You know the tsunami is coming, but you don't even have higher ground to go to. So what's the point? So either you have the contingency plan in place, otherwise getting information is more painful death. Don't do that. Either you have a plan put in place or you don't. So I think that's where the task force need to really put in place like an agency that across different units, as well as private sectors and university, like informs community. So I think as a team, we have a better chance to actually develop a more resilient supply chain and supply chain response to a potential crisis, and also talk about how to respond. So I think this is something we need to keep in mind. So it's not just the early warning sign, it's what do you do with it?
So I think this is a good chance to put this question to you both, right? So you're both experts in data science and operations research and analytics and the relationship of those fields to supply chains. And some of those terms are new or not fully understood within the policy community. But I'm wondering at sort of a basic level, can you talk about the role of these disciplines in developing solutions to supply chains? And Chris, as I was listening to you talk, I couldn't help but think about analytics at its basic level in terms of descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive. So perhaps you could talk about how these concepts apply in the imperative for experts such as yourself to be at the table.
Well, thank you. Well, I think that is first, as Rob and I really pushing hard, is about supply chain transparency. We need information. Without information, you're shooting in the dark, right? Assuming we have that, then what do you do with it? That's where we can talk about in terms of how to respond to the disruption. For example, our informs community, we have machine learning, artificial intelligence. We do actually do a lot of prescriptive analysis. If this happened, what do you do, right? So for example, during the COVID, we received this kind of infection rates or the number of new cases. We can do predictive analysis where the number of cases is going to increase, and how do we dispatch our vaccination sites or triage or emergency care to different locations such that we can actually put it under control. So we do have this kind of tools. It's more like a humanitarian logistics capability. So Informs has really built on logistics, how to respond to crisis. We're starting out our field since World War II, how to deploy our soldiers, our ammunition, our food supplies to the Europe such that we can win the war. So we have this kind of know-how and capability and experience, and also the analysis. So that's point number one. Point number two is that given this kind of predictive analysis, we could actually can deploy the traveling nurse, because now US, we have this kind of traveling nurse to help out, right? But then where do you deploy them? So we can do predictive analysis, and then we can do prescriptive, right? Now, another example is also in terms of critical mineral supply. I did a project for NASA to investigate to what extent we can actually build the EV batteries that rely on lithium, right? So we know that in terms of the demand coming in and the supplies being available, and then at what point we need to pivot into new materials. So right now, I think that our community can work very well with government agencies, Oak Ridge Laboratories in Tennessee. They are developing new battery technology that without using lithium. Then the question is that we can work together how to actually do the rollout, make the transition, because we cannot purely rely on lithium, because the United States does not have enough reserve to handle the demand is going for the EV. So I think that we can do predictive and prescriptive analysis very effectively. That's what we do.
Great. Rob, anything you'd like to add with that?
Yeah, I think, getting back to the port issue, I think we really have to digitally transform that port. And what that means is that, today, all of the operators in that ecosystem, the shippers, the container lines, the truckers, the railroads, the warehouses, they're all operating independently. And so there really isn't any central data repository to help optimize and coordinate all of these different parties. And they're all making a lot of money right now but their performance is abysmal. So I think what we need to do is start by getting the government needs to step in and build an integrated data platform to pull all this data together. And then we can start to propose some of the solutions that Chris was talking about: predictive analysis, coordination, network optimization, scheduling optimization, being able to model, build a digital twin of what's going on in the network, and trying to figure out how to improve it, and doing scenario analysis. I mean, these are great things, but you've got to have the data. Right now, the data is all over the place, so we have to pull that data together. And I think not everyone's open to sharing data, and that's part of the problem. And we have to. Are we going to mandate this? Is the government going to have to step in and put in some regulations around this? The LA port brings in 40% of the economic volume into this country. It's a national resource. It's a treasure. We got to preserve it, and we got to optimize it. Otherwise, that we don't have any other options really right now to bring in the volume of stuff that we can through LA.
Sure. So, when we talk about supply chains, oftentimes supply chain is sort of this ubiquitous term for everything that's going on. But obviously there are multiple supply chains for multiple industries, and they're not all created equal, and the risk is not all evenly distributed. But I'm wondering, off the top of your minds, are there a handful of sectors that are more vulnerable to where we are now than others? And if so, why? Chris, I'd start with you.
Okay, well, I think that's when we started in terms of outsourcing and then offshoring to other countries, there was underlying assumption that the global trade is frictionless. It's a free trade, everyone's happy, no problem. But the pandemic and the geopolitical issues unearth some of the problems. So now we know that it's not exactly frictionless. So now I think the American public has woken up, and now we need to think about how to go about doing it. Now, I think that we, at one level, we need to rethink about our supply chain design. Are we going to continue rely on imports, or we need to pivot into hybrid? This is the moment of truth, because now we have $1.2 trillion of infrastructure bill being passed. And this is the time for us to think about, to coordinate. If we are going to do more reshoring, the supply chain design could be different. If we continue to rely on import, 40% coming to Los Angeles and LA ports, then the automation, the information system also need to be updated as well as infrastructure. So I think that's why I don't think a single agency in the government can handle this. It's multiple agencies and multiple sectors. Now, Rob talked about in terms of information sharing. I talked with the port. I think the public did not realize it. The port, the government's role is only the landlord. All the terminals operators, they are all private companies. Trucking companies are private companies. The government is not easy completely have to dictate the terms. The mandate will not be that easy. So I think instead of starting of mandating top down, maybe bring all these private sectors to the table to talk about how to make the pie become bigger so everyone can win, right? So because of mandates, they can actually play games. Well, garbage in, garbage out, they can give you useless information. So unless they see that it's really in the interest of everyone as a national security, as also for the consumers, then they were more willing to share the information. Now, once they share the information truthfully, informed community can really do magic for the nation. we can actually provide very good solutions such that to synchronize. Right now, the port operations is asynchronous. No one knows who's doing what. If we have the information in real time, our community can do synchronous operations such that we can coordinate the terminal and the truck drivers. When they come in, the containers ready to put on top of the chassis, and then they go. That could be it's a synchronous operations. It's possible, but right now we don't have the information, we don't have the automation capabilities, and we don't have the incentive to coordinate. So therefore, before we actually do all this predictive, prescriptive analysis, Rob is right. We don't have the right information and the right incentive for all these multi-entities to coordinate, to communicate, and collaborate. So I think we need to overcome this hurdle first.
Great. So I see we're getting close to our time. So let me throw one last question out to both of you. Right, so the supply chain is a short-term problem and a long-term imperative. So with the idea of normal in air quotes, when do we see a return to normalcy of our supply chains? And what immediate risks are in front of us that would jeopardize that getting back to that short-term normalcy? Rob, why don't I start with you?
Yeah, when you say normal, I think if we talk about the port and the disruptions that we're seeing, people are saying maybe late 2022, we're not going to see any improvement in the short term. Even when we get through Christmas, we're going to be stuck for some time with these things that are just, there's a surge in demand. There just isn't enough capacity coming through the port. There's still labor shortages, high levels of job vacancies. These are infrastructural elements that are not going to go away. In terms of normal, I think semiconductors, we have lead times that are going out well into 2023 right now as well. So semiconductors, by the way, are used in everything. They're used not just in cars. They're used in phones, in toys, in refrigerators, thermostats, you name it. They're in everything now, since we've digitized everything. So I think it's going to be quite a bit of time before it occurs. The other problem, of course, is COVID. We don't really know what's going on with the Omicron virus yet, but there's other variants. And so long as we have unvaccinated countries all over the world, South Africa is just one of them, but there's many other countries with low vaccination rates. Until we get the world vaccinated, we're going to continue to see disruptions around the world because it'll interfere with supply chains. Supply chains are run by people and not by machines. And so we need people to run them. And if people are sick or aren't going to work, that's going to continue to be a problem. And we have to think of these vaccines as a utility to get them everywhere in the world. And we have to work with the pharmaceutical companies and the distribution companies to help make that happen.
Great. Chris, any thoughts on your end?
Yeah, well, I fully agree with Rob. In the short term, COVID, we must put COVID under control. Otherwise, it could continue to be chaotic. Now, in the short term, if COVID can be under control, then I think the port operations, as pointed out, the timeline is absolutely right on target now. But I'm an optimist. So I think in the long term, we have a golden opportunity that the United States should really consider. This is the partnership with Canada and Mexico. Right now, the port is really overly congested, and doing the automation could be complicated because of union laws and whatnot. But don't overlook the potential of Mexico. Just along the southern part of south of California, there are ports in Ensenada in Mexico, and also there's another port called Lázaro Cárdenas. Now, based on my interaction with the railroad and the port infrastructure, once it's better developed, it takes some time. Once developed, the cost of transporting a container from the port on the West Coast to Texas it's actually cheaper to go through Mexico than go through Los Angeles. So therefore, that is where the supply chain design come into play. And also in terms of reshoring, nearshoring, I think Mexico can play a really critical role to actually secure the supply chain in the United States. So that is a long-term solution.
Great. Well, Chris, Rob, thank you both for your time today and your insights, for all the work you do at your respective universities and on behalf of Informs. We appreciate it. For those of you who are watching live or who registered to watch this, we'll be sending out a link to this recording along with my contact information so that you have the chance, if you'd like, to get in touch with Chris and Rob through Informs. In the meantime, mark on your calendars January 13th. That's the next supply chain webinar that we'll have with Ting Long Dai of Johns Hopkins University and Sundaresh Haragu of Oklahoma State. So thank you for your time. We look forward to seeing you, and Informs is delighted to be here to be a resource as you work to tackle these issues. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.